Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Christina McHale, and thank you for participating in today's 1403rd Justice Clearinghouse webinar. During today's webinar, we'll be discussing communications and boundaries. We all know people in our lives who we wish we could be more like when communicating in difficult situations, whether at work or at home. But why do they communicate so much better than us? What makes them a born leader? How do they know when to set boundaries and when to stick to them? Well, during today's webinar, we'll focus on three main areas of work and personal life interactions: being a leader versus a manager, how to set and stick to boundaries, and finally, how to recognize unhealthy relationships. Our speaker today is Barbara Gould. Barbara Gould owns Gould Consulting, a corrections officer consulting and training business that offers high quality training and consulting to sheriff's offices across the U.S. Barbara started her career at the Genesee County Sheriff's Office in Flint, Michigan in 1997. Barbara served in many capacities within the jail and developed the training coordinator position in Genesee County. After retiring from the sheriff's office in 2018, Barbara served all 83 sheriff's offices in the state of Michigan as their director of training for the Michigan Sheriff's Coordinating and Training Council. I do also want to take a moment to thank our friends and partners for helping with today's webinar. Today's webinar is done in partnership with the American Jail Association. We truly appreciate working with organizations like AJA who are so committed to enhancing and growing the profession. And now, briefly, before we begin, I'd like to share with you some information about the Justice Clearinghouse. The Justice Clearinghouse is the only peer-to-peer educational program for justice professionals that emphasizes the multidisciplinary nature of an effective justice system. Through our various online trainings, our audience and subscribers begin to develop a comprehensive understanding of the justice system while breaking down its many misconceptions. While our webinar events are free to attend live, our subscribers receive 24/7 access to over 1,400 hours of recorded webinars and are eligible to receive certificates of attendance that can be used when seeking continuing education credits. So if you're not presently a subscriber, I would invite you to join today and support our work. And the last thing I want to address with everybody are some basic housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes and will be available to subscribers on the Justice Clearinghouse website. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type as many questions as you have in the Zoom questions box area. We'll take as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Next, our speaker has provided a handout as part of today's webinar. We'll be sharing it in the chat box, but if you miss it, don't worry. You can always download all of your handouts from today's webinar resource page, which you'll find at the bottom of our homepage. You'll also get a link to that resource page when Erin sends out the recording links in your emails tomorrow. We also have several polling questions during our webinar day, and so just by way of a trial run, I'd like to ask the first polling question, and today's a new polling question. So how long have you been in your current role or profession in the criminal justice community? Your options are 0 to 3 years, 4 to 7 years, 8 to 15 years, or more than 15 years. And while we're getting your votes in, I did want to remind everybody that after today's webinar, there will be a follow-up survey, and we do ask that you complete it. Your feedback helps us shape everything we do here at Justice Clearinghouse. And oh my goodness, you all have done a great job of getting your votes in. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and share the results. So 23% of you said that first category, 0 to 3 years. 13% of you said 4 to 7 years. 26% of you said 8 to 15 years, and 39% of you said more than 15 years. Well, congratulations to all of you for all of your service. We really do appreciate it. And with that, let's turn our presentation over to our instructor for the day. Welcome back, everybody. Barbara, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Chris. Welcome, everybody. I am so excited to do this presentation for you today, and I'm very grateful that you have joined us. We're going to discuss communication and boundaries. As Chris had mentioned, when I was working in the jail here in Flint, Michigan, there was always that person, at least one, working in an area, in a pod, on a shift, that no matter what came their way, they handled it with ease and grace. It was very uncommon to watch them get angry or lash out. And I started to wonder why. What made them different from me? Because if you work in a profession where you're dealing with people and you have any type of position of authority, it can be very easy to let your emotions take over. Because a lot of times the people we deal with, especially in law enforcement and corrections, they don't want to be there with you. So their negativity kind of bounds over into you. But then I watch these people that I work with, and they're such great communicators. And I'm like, how are they doing this? Like, I have to know. And I started talking to these people and I started doing some research. I attended any training I could. There weren't very many on boundaries that I found, 20 plus years. Just recently has that really been a discussion that we've been having. So today I want to have that discussion with you all. So I ask that during this presentation, you just, pay attention, take notes. There is a handout. I do ask that you not reuse any of this without permission. We will handle questions at the end. So if you have any questions regarding this or any of the material, I'd be happy to answer that. So I have two polling questions while we do this presentation today. Chris, would you please run that first polling question, please?
You bet. That first polling question is open, folks. And the question is, how much training have you had in communication, specifically on boundaries? Your options are none, 0 to 5 hours, 6 to 10 hours, or more than 10 hours, so 11 or more hours. We'll give everybody a few more seconds to get their votes in, but my goodness, Barbara, they're doing a pretty darn good job of getting votes in pretty quickly. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and share the results. So, Barbara, 31%, it sounds like they had a lot of the same experiences that you did. 31% said they've had no training about communication, specifically with regard to boundaries. 45% that said that next bucket, 1 to 5 hours. 12% said 6 to 10 hours. And then 12% said more than 10 hours. Barbara, was that about what you expected? What's your take on this?
Actually, I didn't really expect that many people to say they've had more than 10 hours. Training on boundaries can be very difficult to find, especially when you're doing any type of first responder work. So I'm very excited to see that 12%. But as far as the none category, yeah, I kind of expected that. I had a hard time finding trainings on boundaries. So thank you, everyone, for answering. One of the reasons I asked this question is because over my years in my career, I just really was an advocate for training. You can never have too much training. Even if you attend a training and you're like, wow, this kind of feels like very similar to something else that I've done, I want to remind everybody that what we hear repeatedly and what we say to ourselves, that little inner voice or, cognitive declarations that we may do, these are the things that shape our unconscious mind, which then shapes our conscious mind and who we are. So, communication and boundaries is something that we have to train on. It's something that we have to practice at. It doesn't always come natural and easy to all of us. So thank you. Thank you very much for answering that polling in those questions. For some reason, there we go. Okay. So Chris mentioned the objectives. We're going to cover these main points here. We must verbally communicate our boundaries to others. Even if we try to use like unconscious expectations, we don't like to be touched, so we don't touch others, or we always have a dialed in uniform, so we expect those around us to have a dialed in uniform. While that is great, we still, when it comes to boundaries, we must respectfully communicate those if we expect people to follow them. And there's three sections here, and they kind of bleed into each other, and one will dovetail into the next. So the first one that we're going to cover is what's a leader versus a manager. So a big part, whether you prefer to be more of a leader style or a management style, because we all are, even if you don't have a supervisory role, that really doesn't matter. You have people that you work with or those that you're responsible for. Therefore, in my eyes, you are a supervisor, okay? And you are exuberating either leadership style or management style when you're around these people. History shows, whether it's Confucius way back in 500 BC, Confucius, if you don't know, he's a very famous philosopher. Whether it's Luke out of the Bible, the Christian Bible, Peter Kropotkin, who is a geographer and theorist, they all say the same thing. How you treat others is how they're going to treat you. So treat them how you want to be treated. Right? Doesn't matter what style you prefer to use, leader or management. And a big takeaway from this too, I think, is when we kind of bring in the boundary side. Don't set boundaries you couldn't or wouldn't be able to adhere to. Don't put those expectations on other people if the roles were reversed and you felt that you couldn't adhere to those boundaries. So, qualities we want. This is pretty easy, right? We want somebody that knows their job and yours, right? So this is a perfect example of somebody having a boundary on education and training. We want our leaders to be honest. This is a boundary on not making things up, not telling lies. We want our leaders and our managers to have good communication skills. So this is a perfect example of a boundary on emotional control, right? Even if somebody makes you angry, you're going to think and you're going to speak before you act, right? That's a boundary. So there's also this list of things that we don't want. And another communication class that I teach, I normally have my class make this list out themselves. And the list of what we don't want is typically longer than what we want, right? Micromanager, they're dishonest, they pass blame, they're reactive, rude, right? These are perfect examples of people that have no boundaries and poor communication on those boundaries. They don't set and follow expectations. So great leaders typically utilize the qualities of being both a leader and a manager. Whether you supervise more like one or the other, it doesn't really matter, but boundaries are essential, absolutely essential. Even though the approach might be a little different, having those boundaries is absolutely essential. So we're going to run our second polling question. Chris, if you wouldn't mind taking over, please.
You bet. That second polling question is open. The question is, which quality do you admire or want most in a good supervisor, manager, or leader? Your options are team player, knows their job and yours, communication and listening skills, organized, or manages themselves and others well. Now, we know all of those characteristics are probably important to varying degrees to each of you, but which one is the most important? Which one do you admire the most? It's kind of hard to pick, Barbara. You made this difficult.
I know it. And, when you think of a good leader, should really think about somebody that you've gone through some sort of issue or dilemma with. And what was it about them that made that situation resolve quickly?
Well, I guess at different points in time, different ones of these skills are going to be maybe more important than others. But again, they're all important. So let's see what the audience said here. In the interest of time, I'll go ahead and close the polling and share the results. So Barbara, 12% said team player. 12% said knows their job, theirs and yours. 50% said communication and listening skills. 2% said organized, and 24% said manages themselves and others well. Was that what you were thinking you did, the responses you'd be getting?
Yes. Yep. So as time goes on, you're seeing more and more. You have to be able to communicate and you have to be able to listen. Well, and communication and listening dovetails into those boundaries that we have to set. So, nope, that's awesome. That's great. Thank you, everybody, for participating. So I asked that question because I was reading some information provided by the business training experts. You can find them on LinkedIn, but they did a poll, and they did a poll with supervisors, and they did a poll of subordinates. And this is the list that they came up with. So strong management, team player, goal-oriented, great communicator, and excellent listener. So that's right in line with what you guys picked, especially the communication piece. So now that we know that communication is absolutely important, right? We have to have a management style. We have to be able to communicate. We have to be able to listen. How do we integrate that style and who we are with boundaries? How do we add those in to our daily life, whether honestly we're at work or we're at home? Because we should be practicing them in both places. Well, first, we must know what boundaries are and how to set them. So boundaries, super easy. They are limits, they are rules, they are expectations, they are guides for what behaviors we will and won't accept. The most basic boundary is the word no. No, no, thank you, not right now. That is the most basic boundary. So we're going to use boundaries to define who we are and what we expect from other people. What they are not retaliatory. They are not threats. They do not dismiss another's feelings. We don't use boundaries to get back at someone. We don't set a boundary because somebody made us angry. Boundaries should be formed and in place long before you have any type of interaction or altercation with somebody. Because remember, boundaries should be personal to you. Okay, I give an example sometimes. So depending on where I've worked over the years, some companies are very huggy. They like to hug. I'm not much of a hugger. So for me, a handshake or a fist bump is more than adequate. So I have to set that boundary, even if going into a situation, I'm like, well, this might make those people feel uncomfortable. Boundaries are not set for other people. Boundaries are set for us, what we need. And that's why we set them. So I set that boundary. And it's not to be mean. It's not because, I don't want, any of them to just touch me. I think they're gross. I set it because that just makes me uncomfortable, right? And we'll go through how to explain boundaries and examples of how to say boundaries, what some language is to kind of help you, because you're going to have to practice these. You're going to have to practice boundaries, not just at home, but at work also. So how do you know if you lack boundaries? So in general, you're going to feel like someone has power over you, and this is going to affect you mentally or physically. You could have resentment. You see this a lot with codependency, which is just an unhealthy relying upon others, maybe one person in particular. You have a little less accountability than maybe you would like. Your actions, emotions, and behavior in general, you don't always take accountability for them. At work, you take on others' responsibilities. And though this sounds great, right? Like there's no I in team, You want to be a team player, but if you sacrifice yourself so much mentally and physically to make up for other people's, unaccountability, then that's no good. You're actually defeating the goal, and you need to set a boundary. So your priorities might be misplaced. You cross the lines of your job description. Again, doing other people's jobs, whether it's someone your same rank, above you, below you. You seek to change others. If you've been in this career field long enough, then you know you cannot change others. The only thing we can change is how we respond and we react. You know, if you lack boundaries at work, if you're having a lot of conflicts, when you set and stick to boundaries, you actually begin to control your own emotions and your own behavior. So you're setting an example for those around you of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And then a big one to know if you lack boundaries, and this is a hard one, is you take work home. If you have been doing any type of training, whether it's online or in person, conferences, doesn't matter, you will notice that there is a huge uptick in wellness training. And a lot of wellness training is how to deal with stress, right? There's different things you can do, even on your ride home. It's not maybe going to take away the stress, but it's going to help you deal with it. So when you get home, your home life can be your home life. Because when you're constantly taking work home or taking home to work, you are bleeding across those boundary lines and just setting yourself up for constant conflicts. Some myths about boundaries. Boundaries are not selfish. You do set them for yourself, but they're not selfish. When we control ourselves through boundaries, we actually help others, right? We're not escalating situations. We're being the example. Negative consequences to boundaries. You know what? Sometimes there might be, but a lot of times we can anticipate what that's going to be. Boundaries help take away any confusion and help stop any type of manipulation. Again, I mentioned before, and I'm probably going to say it again because this is very important. Boundaries should never be retaliatory. They should never be made and put into place when you're angry or you feel hurt. They should never be put into place to try and attack someone. Another myth, if you set boundaries, you must be angry. No, actually, it's the opposite, right? You're trying to set these boundaries so everybody knows how to play the game, right? You're all on the field. Everybody knows what's expected and not expected. And this helps everybody stay in control. And the last one there, boundaries can be hurtful. Well, sometimes people might feel as if they're hurtful, but if you set your boundary in a respectful manner, then there's no hurt, there's no harm done there. A big thing is to make sure your boundary is not unreasonable. Okay, if you don't like people sitting right next to you, but say in the jail, you know when you work the control room, you have to work with somebody right next to you. It is not reasonable to tell somebody, please don't sit next to me, right? Our boundaries have to be within context and they cannot be unreasonable. So how do we come up with these boundaries? Well, we got to identify what the true problem is, what it is that makes us feel uncomfortable, what it is that we don't like from others and sometimes ourselves. We want to respond rather than react. Think about the consequences because sometimes there are consequences. Ask yourself, does this support me? Does this support where I'm going? My goals? And is this boundary just that, a boundary, or is this retaliation? So define your boundary, communicate your boundaries, keep it simple. We're going to go through that here in a few minutes. Do not over explain. When we over explain, say I walked into that conference and people were trying to give me hugs and I just put out my hand to fist bump and I start in, I'm sorry, I don't like hugs. There's just something that if you're not family, I don't want to be that close to you. Don't over explain. People don't want to hear that. Just say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not a hugger. Fist bump. You can keep it positive. You can keep it light, keep it short. Absolutely. And then if you need to set consequences, if any of you have kids at home, you're probably pretty good at setting boundaries at home, right? If you don't put on your shoes, you can't go outside, right? The consequence, they can't go outside. Pretty simple. So boundaries on self. So a good place to start, if you're a little unsure of how to begin setting boundaries onto others, is to begin with ourselves, because we are responsible for the physical boundaries that make us comfortable or uncomfortable. We are responsible for our financial boundaries or lack thereof, right? Because those can have consequences. Spiritual boundaries, sexual boundaries, work boundaries. Yep, we have to think about those. What are things that are acceptable and not acceptable? And if you have policies and procedures that you have to abide by, you need to make sure your boundaries follow in line with them. Time boundaries, who you give your time to, who you spend time with. Verbal boundaries, how you speak, when you speak, your tone, and then emotional boundaries. So when we start practicing boundaries and what we like and what we don't like, we're giving ourselves the authority to have control over our emotions, right? I'm going to set this boundary. I'm going to let this person know what is expected. I'm going to keep it simple. I'm not going to over explain. And if it keeps happening, if they keep disregarding my boundary, then I'm going to have to tell them again what my boundary is and set some consequences. But remember, those need to be reasonable, right? This isn't retaliatory. We're not getting back at people for something that we feel that they've done to us. So some examples. While you're at work, breaks taken. If any of you are fairly new to your profession, you probably work through your breaks, right? You want to prove and show that you're a go-getter. You keep working right through. If you've been on the job a little while, maybe you don't take your break because you're like, well, I really have nowhere to go or nothing to do, so I'm just going to stay here and work. I can't tell you enough. When you do that, you are setting a pattern for what will then be expected of you. So set that boundary and make sure you take your breaks. If you have a job where you have to give written responses, typically email, within, set a boundary. Well, I'm going to do it within 24 or 48 hours. Make sure it's in line with your policies and procedures. Make sure your bosses are aware and this is acceptable. Another one, no working while at home or doing home things while at work. And this can be hard. I know a lot of days, people, you guys are working long shifts. You're working 12, 16 hours. So sometimes home does bleed over into work, right? There's things, home life doesn't stop because you're at work. I get it. But there still needs to be that boundary and that separation. And we're going to go into a little more detail on some boundaries on that in just a minute. No texting with subordinates. Well, I can't tell you how many times I have seen a supervisor get in trouble because you get promoted from the pool, right? The pool of your friends, the pool of your coworkers, and you're now their supervisor. And you have to enforce the rules, but you still want to be their buddy. So you maintain that texting relationship with them. only to find out that something you said candidly over text is now being used against you from your subordinate. So these are just examples of boundaries that you can do, okay? At home, no electronics during dinner. I know, not everybody in the home is going to like this, even the adults, but it's important, right? Social media and TV off by a certain time. A huge one is no posting of pictures of others on social media without their consent. Be a buddy instead of a bully is what I tell friends of mine's kids. When you take pictures of siblings or friends and that person feels it's an embarrassing photo or video and you post it online, that's kind of starting to fall in the realm of bullying, right? So we set that boundary so we understand what behavior is acceptable. If you have older kids at home, hey, you want to take my vehicle? You got to return it the way you found it, right? So if I had half a tank of gas, don't bring it back on E. Bring it back with half a tank of gas. If it was clean on the outside and you ran through some mud puddles, run it through a car wash. Return it how you found it, but have those clear examples so everybody's on the same page. Some examples of boundary with yourself. Setting limits on when you'll eat, how much money you're going to put away, whether it's savings or investments, how many minutes per day you spend exercising, this many minutes if it's a work day, this many minutes if it's a non-work day. But just really getting started setting those healthy boundaries. And the easiest way is to set those boundaries with ourselves. So we set some boundaries. Okay. We've figured out what we like and what we don't like, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. We've come up with some lines that we're going to say to keep it short and simple, not over explain, right? We've thought about the consequences. So what happens then if we get resistance? Well, you're probably going to get resistance, okay? And the two main forms of resistance are either going to be anger, an anger response, or they're going to try and make you feel guilty. But I want you to remember, others will turn angry at you or even try to guilt you into removing or relaxing on the boundary because they don't like self-accountability or having consequences for their behavior. That's on them. Okay, that is something they have to deal with. That is a process they have to go through. And that's okay. Your boundaries should not be mean, right? You're holding them accountable and you're making sure they understand where you stand. The only people who really get upset about you setting boundaries are the ones benefiting from you having none. Remember that. So if somebody's upset with you because you've now started enforcing or have set a boundary, just remember, they're probably really not that upset at you. They're upset at themselves because something they did has now caused you to set and implement this boundary. Resistance to responses, short things that you can say. Time is very precious. You're working long shifts. Yes, you do have more days off typically, but that doesn't mean that your time isn't even more precious, right? Because those days that you're working, you're not really seeing your family or friends very much. So if somebody invites you to do something, they want to spend time with you, whatever that may be, you don't always have to say no, because remember, no is the prime example of an initial boundary. But you can tell them something like, okay, I'll stop by, but I can only stay for this amount of time. Okay, so you're agreeing to go, but you're setting that boundary. And when that time limit has come, then you need to go. Okay. When we set boundaries, we also need to stick to them, right? If you have somebody at work that's always asking you uncomfortable questions, uh, you see this a lot if you end up having a partner. That's what you have to do. You sit and talk while you're watching, you're doing your job, in between calls, in between emergencies, whatever it may be. And some people really want to know the dirt and grit on you, right? Don't be afraid to tell them, hey, I would really rather not talk about this at work. Or if it's something that you're truly uncomfortable with, I would really rather not be a part of this conversation. Or, hey, let's talk about something else. I don't want to talk about this. Don't be afraid to set those boundaries. If you need to set personal boundaries first, try self-regulation. This is something that's also in that wellness hub that you hear a lot is, self-regulation. Well, what is self-regulation? Well, it's understanding what you need mentally and physically. So if you've been going to work and you've had other commitments in the evening or in the morning, depending on what shift you work, and you've been extremely social, don't be afraid to turn down invitations for your days off. And don't be afraid to tell people, hey, I've been social all week, or I've been working a lot all week, so I need my days off to myself. Don't be afraid to set those boundaries. And that may not be every time you have days off, right? You can set boundaries and communicate boundaries as you need them. Emotionally available to others. This is huge. Don't be afraid to tell somebody, I don't have the emotional capacity to discuss this with you right now. Especially if you're discussing traumatic events, corrections, law enforcement, EMS, fire. We can see a lot of traumatic events, CPS. Be mindful that if you were the general public, would you want somebody to tell you this story, right? Because we like talking about our work days with our friends and families, but we have to remember there needs to be boundaries, not just the legal boundaries that constrain us, but there needs to be boundaries for other people's well-being. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're setting boundaries. And then there's always the fallback, you know. A big one that I go to is I just like to tell people I respectfully agree to disagree. I know we're not seeing eye to eye, and that's okay. So let's just respectfully agree to disagree and then move on with the situation or the conversation. Okay, so what is a boundary and what is not a boundary? So you're at work and you have a supervisor that is talking to you very condescending and very disrespectfully. Do you have to accept that just because you are at work? Absolutely not. But telling them, don't speak to me in a disrespectful tone, that's not a boundary. Okay, that's a demand. What is a boundary is letting them know, hey, we can finish this conversation when you aren't raising your voice at me. How about we take a break and we reconvene to discuss this tomorrow in half an hour, whatever you feel best in knowing that person, and then do what you say you're going to do. Revisit that conversation. With family, hey, don't call me when I'm at work. Okay, well, that can come off really disrespectful and hurtful, right? So an example of a boundary for that is, hey, I can't answer a lot of phone calls during work when I'm at work. When I do, I lose focus or I have to stop what I'm doing. Put it in terms where they can understand, but also keeping it short and simple. I don't want to speak to you right now. If you're having a lot of emotions and you're afraid you're not going to have any control, let somebody know, I need some time to myself to cool off. Can we talk in 10 minutes when I have a break, tomorrow, whatever it may be, short and simple, but don't make demands. Okay. Telling people to stop asking me personal questions. That's not a boundary, that's a demand. Okay. And demands can be seen as anger or retaliatory. Some more examples. So being at home. Again, if you have kids, especially as they're getting older and they're getting more emotions and hormones and they don't know what to do and things come out in all sorts of ways, let them know. I understand you're upset. So am I. Let's cool off. We'll talk again after dinner and then follow through. Okay. Follow through on that boundary. Don't make snide comments. Don't keep bringing it up after dinner, then talk about it. Little kids especially, hey, if you want to play outside, you must put on your coat, hat, and gloves. Otherwise, we can't go outside and play in the snow. It's too cold. Just let them know this is what's going to happen. This is what must happen for you to get what you want. With significant others, this is huge. I've been married to somebody in the same career field as me for 22 years, and I can tell you this can be extremely difficult sometimes setting these boundaries, these communication boundaries. And there's a couple examples here. One deals with finances, letting them know our finances are not healthy right now, and I fear what could happen if we keep spending so much. Let's brainstorm some ideas on how we can divert more money to our savings, investments, whatever it may be, and talk together on your next day off. So this is a fantastic boundary example because what are you doing? You're not just setting that boundary that, hey, we need to shore up our spending, but you're also kind of taking that blame off of them. Like if they're the spender in the relationship, you're taking that blame off of them and you're asking them to actively communicate and participate in setting those financial boundaries. And you'll have a lot more success once you do that. With parents and family, I have grown children, I have grandchildren, and I know as a parent to grown children, one of the things we love the most is to give advice. But it's not always the advice that they asked for, wanted, or needed. So, encourage your kids. Remember, they're gonna pick up on what you're doing, what you teach, the examples you show, how you talk. Don't be surprised if you hear, thank you for sharing your advice, or thank you for your opinion. I'll let you know what we decide. And that's okay, right? If we're going to set boundaries, we have to be okay with people setting boundaries with us. Remember, boundaries are the lines we draw or the limits we put in place so that we can love ourselves and others at the same time. Okay, at work, here's some more examples with bosses. Now, as long as this doesn't, violate any contracts, especially regarding overtime, if there's something special that's coming up, maybe there's a community event and your boss is looking for volunteers, but you have something going on with friends, family, or even by yourself, it doesn't matter. You have another commitment. There's no harm in telling them, I understand you would like me to work over. However, I have a prior commitment. And just let them know you can't do that. Vacations, oh, so few and far between and very sacred, right? When you have them. But if you've worked yourself into a position where a lot of people rely on you, then you might want to really enforce that boundary of, hey, while I'm on vacation next week or whenever it is, I will be unavailable. Like I will return texts, emails, phone calls within 48 hours of my return, depending on when you come back. Set that time so people can expect and know, okay, they're going to be gone Sunday through Thursday, but I know anything I send them, they're going to get back to me on Friday or Monday, right? People like expectations when we set boundaries. They like to know what we expect of them. Coworkers, hey, we agreed on splitting work duties this morning. I would appreciate it if you would stick to complete your agreed duties. So we saw this working a lot on our pods. We had 113 inmates. We had 2 officers. Typically, you had one officer that handled the door. By that, I mean the security of the keys. They opened the door, they would do nurse, medication, deliveries. And then the other officer was responsible for doing rounds, going to every cell and checking on every person every 30 to 60 minutes. So if you agree, hey, for the first 3 hours, you're doing the rounds and I'm handling the door, but now you're 2 hours in and that coworker's only done one round, you need to say something. You need to let them know they need to stick to their agreed duties. And if they don't, then that now causes a problem. So now that's when you need to let them know that there might be a consequence. Hey, we agreed to split our duties this morning. I can't do both the door and the rounds. That's why we split everything up. So if you don't start holding up your end of the bargain, I'm going to have to communicate this with supervision. And I know we don't want to say that to coworkers, but we need to, because I'll tell you right now, if you're in a similar situation, if somebody were to hurt themselves or hang themselves on that pod and it wasn't caught right away because your partner didn't do their rounds, when you get sued and go to court, nobody cares if you guys divided the duties up that morning. No one. The courts don't care, the jury doesn't care, the family of that person doesn't care. All anybody cares about is that's where you were working, these were the duties assigned to you, and somebody had to get them done. Okay, so enforce those boundaries with coworkers. Make sure they understand and you are both on the same page. All right, some more examples of yourself. Again, this is a great place to start. If you haven't been real strong in drawing boundaries and communicating them, start with yourself. Tell yourself when you're at work, hey, I'm not going to gossip or repeat anything I've learned about somebody anymore. If somebody tells me something, I'm going to play it off like I haven't heard it before. If it's gossip or information that's of a sensitive nature, I'm going to let them know, hey, I don't feel comfortable discussing this. And set those boundaries on yourself, because when you put them on yourself, it's then going to be easier to set them on the boundaries up onto others. In general, budgets. A budget is a boundary. It's a rule, right? It's something that you set to stick to so that something else can happen, right? Like retiring on time or taking that vacation. Meal prepping, planning meals. That's a boundary you set with yourself so you don't eat out so much, right? Meals of convenience can be very easy when you work in this profession and you are go, 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 busy, busy, busy all the time. So good fences make good neighbors. I'm sure just about all of you have heard this quotation from Robert Frost, and it really is true. If you think about it, fences are like boundaries. If you buy a house and you put up a fence on your property line, you are telling your neighbor that side of the fence is yours, right? They know exactly what is theirs and you know exactly what is yours. So that's a good boundary. One of the ways we lose our boundaries is by relaxing them. And we tend to relax them when we're stressed, we're sad, we're angry, we're overwhelmed. And this is when we most commonly see unhealthy relationships develop. These can be on duty, these can be off duty, but I've seen a lot of really good people ruin their careers or their personal lives because they didn't know how to recognize unhealthy relationships, and the people around them and closest to them didn't know how to recognize unhealthy relationships. So the first sign, it's not even going to be at work. Your personal life is going to be in disarray. It's going to be up in arms. It doesn't matter if it's divorce, separation, significant illness. It can be your illness, child's spouse, doesn't matter. Something is emotionally upsetting and draining, making you vulnerable. So we look for someone to talk to. Now, I've worked with a lot of people that say, hey, I prefer to be by myself. I prefer to work by myself. But at the end of the day, humans are social beings. We want someone to talk to. We want somebody that can sympathize with us, right? And this just crosses a whole bunch of different boundary lines depending on who we choose to talk to. We find that shoulder to cry on, and we develop a relationship. And that's when sign number 2 comes into play. You have day-to-day contact with this person. Makes it easy for that person to identify with you because they're probably in the same or similar career field, right? But be careful, because some of these people, they see your disarray, they see your relaxed or lack of boundaries, they see you coming, and they want to manipulate you for their own benefit, nothing more. Once you do a small favor, on duty, off duty, doesn't matter, it can quickly become an obligation, which then turns into manipulation. So think of, you're at work. If you work in a closed environment like an office or in the jail, like I did, and you're constantly going to that other person's duty station, or you're constantly asking to work with them, that's a problem. At home, maybe you make a connection with a cashier, so you start frequenting the store. Maybe at your favorite restaurant, you make a connection with a worker there. That can be a problem. Once we make this connection and we start doing those favors and the manipulation starts, then we look for opportunities to contact them, right? More opportunities. We want to talk to them. We want to text them. We want to email them. Maybe we're having inappropriate thoughts regarding that person. And inappropriate thoughts aren't always sexual, right? If you're having an issue at home and you've committed with your partner that you are going to try and make it work, that's a boundary. So now if you're having thoughts about, hey, I bet that person at the diner, they really get me. I bet daily life with them would be a whole lot easier. You've crossed that boundary that you've already started and given with your significant other, right? You see how this is kind of snowballing down a path that's not very healthy. So then we go into more correspondence, right? We don't see a lot of things like letters and love letters. But I had a supervisor tell me very early on in my career, on duty, off duty, it doesn't matter. If it's in writing, it's an exhibit. You never know when you're going to get sued. It could be, a negligence case at work, a wrongful death suit at work. It could be, you're having just issues with your significant other. Anything you put in writing is an exhibit. Doesn't have to always be sexually suggestive or explicit. Okay, but this is physical evidence to be used against you for further manipulation. People will break you down, break all of your boundaries down, and completely utilize you for what they want, right? Because your life is in a disarray. You're a mess right now and you don't know what to do. And you've taken this person on as what you feel is a confidant, but it doesn't always work that way. So the final sign to watch for is falling off the cliff. This is now when it has breached any verbal or written communication and it's more personal and physical contact. Again, it doesn't always have to be sexual in nature, but you're supposed to be at home when you get off duty working things out with your significant other, but instead you find yourself at the restaurant waiting for the cashier to get off duty because you guys are going to go hang out, right? Huge, huge stepping on boundaries there. They might as well be non-existent. Work policies, procedures, rules, regulations. If you're doing this stuff on duty, if this happens on duty, all of that has also been violated, not just your boundaries. Okay. If this is you, I hope you get help. If this is somebody you're watching this happen, I hope they don't make it to step number 5. I hope at some point you get them help, right? Counseling doesn't matter, a supervisor, whatever it may be, get them help because this is how good people in a good career field end up killing themselves, or they leave their career, or their career's a mess because everything at home just fell apart, right? And why does all of this happen? Lack of boundaries, relaxed boundaries, boundaries that aren't followed through on. Remember, we can't control others. We can't. We can set those boundaries, which helps to control their behavior, which can help control their emotions, not just our own. But we can't control others. The most we can do is protect ourselves through having boundaries, figuring out what things make us uncomfortable, what things we don't like, getting those boundaries out. I don't care if you like to journal or if you just want to take a piece of paper and start writing things down. Start with yourself, then move to work. I found it was easier for me to have boundaries with myself and people at work than it was at home. Why? Because you have a little more intimate contact with people at home. So it can be hard to tell a, older child or your significant other, hey, I don't want to talk about that right now, right? But we need to have these boundaries. So I hope the biggest takeaways that you get from today kind of are a conglomerate of everything that we've touched on. No matter what your leadership or management style, boundaries are absolutely crucial. Okay. Boundaries let other people know what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. They are not retaliatory. They should never be done to hurt somebody or to get back at somebody. And remember, unhealthy relationships begin because there were no boundaries put into place or those boundaries were relaxed. I just want to say thank you to Chris and Aaron and Justice Clearinghouse and all of you for attending today. I really hope you got something out of today's presentation. Chris, if we have time, are there any questions from the audience?
Oh my goodness, Barbara, look at the emojis flow in. Wow. I think we're going to have you back for part 2 or like the pro tips level of this particular webinar because it's amazing. I was even taking notes here in a couple places. So you did a great job. And just based on just the reaction there from the audience, I know the audience agrees. So thank you so much for doing this presentation. It was so practical and oriented to so many things I know so many people are facing today. So thank you again for doing this. And folks, if you're like me, and you liked this webinar, then do be sure to check out our whole lineup of webinars on our leadership feature page where you'll find our next related webinar. Folks, don't miss this. Join us on July 16th. Brenda Dietzman is going to be back to taking your questions about managing and working with Generation Z. So if you're interested in that or any of our other related webinars, then all you need to do is go to the justiceclearinghouse.com website, go to the navigation button called webinars, drop down to webinars by topic, and then scroll over to leadership. Do take some time, check those out. Man, we've got a slew of webinars coming up for you. And by the way, if you haven't been checking out our master calendar page, I get it. You guys are busy. But in case you've been looking at our master calendar page, we are booking well into 2025. And I actually gave dates away just yesterday for 2026. So we have a great lineup scheduled for you all. Please check it out. We'd love to have you join us. Barbara, oh my goodness, are you ready for some doozies of questions?
Oh, I hope so. All right, bring them on.
Before I get started here, folks, I apologize. There is no way I'm going to get to everybody's questions today. So please, 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 right now, take a screenshot of that very last slide that you see right in front of you. Email Barbara after the webinar. I'm pretty sure she'd be happy to get back to you, especially with some situations that a couple of you texted me about. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer any questions. So Barbara, kicking things off, we have a question that kind of came in a whole bunch of different varieties of question and variations of the same question. So a number of people wanted to know, what should we do when expectations of others are or have become unhealthy or unreasonable? And the examples I've seen, so for example, such as working significant overtime month after month after month, or being always on or always available by cell phones, even on the weekends or holidays, or, as you mentioned earlier, vacation. The expectation might be that we should all make our work our first priority. But in today's world, that just doesn't work for a lot of folks. What should we do when we are trying to set the boundaries, but the cultural expectation, whether that of the manager or the organization, is not in alignment with what we believe is healthy for us?
Wow, that is
Way to kick things off, right?
Yeah. That is a great question. And if you're in the first responder field, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say maybe not all of, but there are some parts of your work life that are unhealthy. For me, I set those boundaries where I no longer participated in those unhealthy boundaries. We used to sit around and laugh and say, man, we thought the gossip and bullying ended with high school. Well, it didn't. It carries on sometimes. But I revert back to what I had mentioned just a little bit ago, letting people know, hey, I'm uncomfortable with this. And if you don't want to say something, and they're telling you something, I don't want to say ignore it, but sometimes ignore it. People will pick up and get the gist. And a lot of times, if enough people decide this is unhealthy, you can shift the culture. And enough people can be as many as, 10 on a shift of 30 or 2 on a shift of 30. It depends on how you carry yourself. When you're setting boundaries, remember, you are not better than anybody else. All you're doing is letting people know this is what you expect. Now, it does put you in a predicament if supervision does not support you in your boundaries and setting those, or if they're part of the problem. All I can really tell you then, if you try and you can't change that culture, is attend every training and education that you can, and you become the supervisor, and you move up that ladder, and you change that culture and those expectations by setting boundaries. Because again, we can't always change other people, but we can change ourselves and how we react.
Well, and that's a great point because maybe that is that person's hint from the universe that you're being called, or the universe is saying, well, if you don't like how the boss is doing things, maybe you should be the boss. That's a really great point, Barbara. Thanks for sharing that. Next question, which is a little bit more on the proactive side. What is the best way to set boundaries with coworkers if you haven't ever set boundaries yet? So, starting from ground zero, how do we do it right the first time?
So, yeah, coworkers can be tricky, especially if you have a close-knit group. I know when I did shift work, that was basically my second family. And I didn't go into my career with a bunch of boundaries. Like I said at the very beginning, I saw these people that communicated so well, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's what I want. That's how I want to be. I'm tired of having conflict all the time. So if you haven't really set those boundaries before and you want to start setting some, I really go back to starting with yourself. People will notice. They will notice the little things that you're doing for yourself. And then I would sit down and I would write out, what are the behaviors? Remember, not the people. This is not about individual people making you uncomfortable or making you mad. It's the behaviors. So what behaviors don't I like? What is upsetting me? And then look at that list and say, okay, what is my priority? And literally just start there. Your coworkers will catch on, right? This doesn't change you. It doesn't change your personality. It might change a little bit of your dynamic with them, but that's okay because they're going to come back with boundaries of their own. Why? Because we're all social. We've watched people around us. And when we like something somebody's doing, we try to emulate it. So that's what I would suggest. Really start with yourself and then make that list of behaviors at work and come up with some things that you could say. Again, simple, short, to the point, not rude, not retaliatory, and then practice those at work. Just remember, if you set a boundary, don't be surprised if a coworker also sets a boundary. And as long as it's reasonable within your scope of work, you're going to have to follow that boundary also.
Well, it's kind of like for those of us who have had teenagers or who have teenagers, invariably a kid is going to tempt that boundary.
Yes.
They're going to look to bend the boundary or break the boundary. So
Yes.
coworkers are in some ways no different.
Absolutely. Yep.
You talked about being social, and that kind of ties into our next question. One of our audience members had an interesting example. They mentioned that they as an employee, they don't like celebrating their birthday at work. But the people they work with, they go out to lunch, they buy gifts for each other, on and on and on. How does a person address situations like this when we express a boundary, but it's not respected? And I could see this in a variety of situations. I don't want to go out to a bar after work because I don't drink. Those kinds of things. How do you how do you set boundaries and then deal with the fact that your coworkers don't respect it? And especially in a situation like this with birthdays.
That's tough. Um, Really, I think communicating that boundary with as many people as possible, or sitting down and figuring out, is there a collaborative solution? Because sometimes going against the work grain of things causes more unintentional bad consequences than what we even saw coming. So I would say make sure as many coworkers as possible understand your boundary that you don't want to celebrate at work, and maybe offer an alternative. How about the day of my birthday? I really don't want to celebrate at work. How about the day of my birthday after work? we all go out for a burger for an hour. Can we celebrate that way? Can we do something different? I want to honor the fact that you guys are being so gracious and wanting to celebrate me, but I really want you guys to respect the fact that I just don't want to celebrate at work. Sometimes boundaries can be a give and take. And I would suggest maybe something along those lines.
Got it. Thank you. Next question. One of our audience members asked, how would you recommend working or communicating with an employee who does not take direction and is a constant contrarian?
Well, I guess I would want a little more detail. Do they not take direction from you? Or do they not take direction from your and this person's supervisor? Because obviously, if they don't take direction from, your and their supervisor, that can be kind of easy. That can be as simple as letting them know, hey, your duties are, this, and you haven't done them. If you don't do them, if you continue to not do them, I'm going to have to call our supervisor. Now, if you're the supervisor and they're not doing what they're supposed to do, then that's pretty easy. You should have a gradual plan or policy in place for discipline, because sometimes that's what people need. They are bucking up against those boundaries. Like you just mentioned, Chris, like a teenager, like I'm going to test this to see what happens. Well, sometimes you have to let people know what's going to happen. You have to follow through with that boundary and that consequence that you've told them of or reminded them of. It may not even be your consequence. It could be part of your policies and you're just reminding them. As far as their attitude, I can tell you a lot of the negative people that I ever encountered and have worked with over the last several decades, they will feed off the energy in the room. And my advice would be to kill them with kindness and positivity, because they will stop, they will shut down, or they will lessen their negative behavior, their negative things that they say. And that can be really hard, because sometimes what people say, even if they're being negative, it might be true, but that doesn't mean you can't put a positive spin on it, right?
Right.
I kind of touched on the whole cognitive declarations in the beginning, and what we hear, what we surround ourselves with, what we tell ourselves. These are the things that our unconscious mind says, oh, this is us. This is what we should be. And then they translate that over into the conscious mind. And that's how we start behaving and we start talking. So really flood that environment with a more positive attitude. And even if it's just one person, I encourage you, you can still do it.
Oh my goodness. I am going to try to squeeze in this very last question because, again, I think it's something that everybody has run into at one point in time or another. Last question of the day, folks. What is a tactful way to communicate with coworkers or, frankly, anybody? How do you decline invitations? Those, people who invite you to lunch or after work events, you just don't have time, or maybe you just don't want to do it or join the group event. What are some polite, tactful ways to be able to say no?
Oh, honestly, there's a lot, and you get really good at it after a while if you practice. Nothing against coworkers or anyone else, but sometimes you want to go home, right? Your family is a priority. And sometimes,
Right.
even with family, you have to kind of keep them at bay. Maybe they get a little overbearing. My favorite thing is, wow, that sounds like a lot of fun. I have to check my schedule. I know I have a lot of family things going on lately, and I'll get back to you. So you've kind of already let them know you're probably not going to go. they'll probably forget about it. But if they bring it up to you again, just be like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not going to be able to make it, but I hope you have fun. And, turn it back on them. Don't end it with a I or a me statement. Kind of turn it back on them. I hope you have fun, because the natural progression of conversation is they're going to say, oh, okay, well, we wish you could come, but yeah, we're going to have a lot of fun, right? They're going to focus on that last thing you said.
Right.
Is really kind of sometimes turning it around. There's a book, and it's by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I try to read this every few years because it really tells you how to communicate with people, not so much the boundary end of things, but communicate with people so that you don't rub them the wrong way, so that any ideas, how to get ideas in there and they think it's their idea, so then they're more motivated to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a great book, but declining invitations can be tricky, especially if you have coworkers that are a little badgering, like, hey, how come you never go out and drink with us? And for me, especially towards the end of my career, I didn't drink. And telling them I don't want to go because I don't drink, that wasn't an acceptable answer, right? They're like, okay, so you don't drink, but you don't have to drink, just come out anyways. Again, short, simple. I really appreciate the invitation, but not this time, or I can't this time, or just, and they'll keep asking, and that's okay. You just keep setting that boundary.
If I remember right, you said the name of the book was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Is that the right one?
It is. Yep.
Excellent. Deborah, that answers your question. Again, Barbara, thank you again for such a fantastic presentation. I have a sneaking suspicion, and I've already had a couple of people text in, that we may want you to come back next year to do some advanced deep dives on boundary setting and communications and all that kind of good stuff. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. It was just an incredible presentation. And again, my apologies to all of you. I know we're over time. If I didn't get to your particular question, there's the email right there on your screen. Email Barbara after the show, and I know she'd be happy to get back to you with any specific answers to questions. And folks, be sure to join us right back here on Thursday for another one of our double headers during our 1 o'clock Eastern webinar. We're talking about pretrial interviews and child witness testimony. Then during the 3 p.m. Eastern time slot, we're discussing recognizing and understanding bias. So do be sure to join us, or have somebody from your organization or agency join us if you can. And with that, this concludes today's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Have a super rest of your day, everybody. We'll see you right back here on Thursday. Bye now.